really going to focus our conversation around developing and implementing your career strategy. And I give this talk and or workshop, depending on how well it translates virtually, a couple times a year usually. And I find that the last 2 times I've done it during COVID, it has been especially helpful for 2 reasons. One, it connects people to each other that are interested in sort of, similar reflective thoughts about their career. But 2, it's meant to be a systematic process through which you can reconnect to your career and what drives you. Although this is, a 90-minute workshop, what I really hope happens is that you can take the sort of blueprint or systematic approach that I'll outline in this workshop and constantly reapply it to how you think about your career. And the timeline on which you'll do that will be different for different people. I usually do it about every 6 months, but I find that what will cue you to do that and how often you find it useful will vary. So just keep that in mind, that I'm covering a lot today. It may not all land with you in terms of where you're at in your thinking, but keep it in your back pocket, because as you continue to revisit it, it will start to become clearer and clearer and eventually become second nature in how you think. So the principles that I'll be going through today draw on a lot of evidence that I've learned over the years. So my experiences as a scientist, as a parent, as a leader, principles from human factors engineering, behavioral science, psychology. So drawing on a lot here, but really distilling it down in an applied way. For those that have just joined us in the last little bit, if you haven't already, please take time to introduce yourself in the chat, and just letting everybody know that we're recording today's session so that it can be available for those that either have to drop off or those that weren't able to fit this into their schedule. Another sort of final reminder as people trickle in, that the more informal and interactive we can make this, the more it will land with all of you, whether you're the person that's interacting or you're someone that's still taking it in and observing. So please feel free to raise your hand if you're familiar with that Zoom function. Type a question in the chat. I will try to keep my eye on the chat. If I don't see it, then Marlena will graciously interrupt me and draw attention to it so that we can address things as they come up. And with that, let's dive in. So this whole workshop really comes from a place of recognizing that we can't lead others, colleagues, our staff, family, friends, whatever frame you choose, any further than you've been yourself. So it's really tapping into that self-reflective process. That being said, I'll be providing you with 5 key insights, or that sort of strategy blueprint that will hopefully refocus the way you're thinking about your career. I'm assuming that that's something that we all have in common, given that we showed up for this talk. And it'll help be like a compass to guide your individual development over time. Okay, so the first question, and I sort of have asked you to do this already, is how you describe yourself to others. So without naming people, I'm just going to read a couple of things I've seen in the chat. We have a postdoctoral researcher from the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. We have research coordinators on the call. We have a clinical pharmacist at Sunnybrook Hospital. Keeping your video off because you have a 4- and 6-year-old at home. I think a lot of us feel you, but thanks for joining. You'll always be able to listen to the recording if you have to jump off for parent reasons. We have a research psychologist specializing in patient decision-making. Project manager, a nurse, teaching, a medical device company, a homeschooler now, apparently. I like the humor. Program coordinators, more research coordinators, first-year master's student, lead physiotherapist for the Canadian men's national volleyball team. So, whether you choose to peruse other people's intros or not, what's really interesting here is there's a common theme across how everybody introduced themselves. Everyone described what they do. So if you look across these, we see, people's title, postdoctoral fellows, physiotherapist, project coordinator, what have you. And we're going to unpack why it is helpful to reframe the way you think about yourself and how you communicate that to others. Also, this is what always happens. It's the easiest way to start this workshop, because everybody, myself included, our default is to tell people what it is we do. And it's often the first question, you know, it's an easy icebreaker for people you've never met before. What do you do? So we're socialized to do that, but let's try to shift that frame a little bit. So the first thing you want to do when you're refocusing your career or reflecting on where you're at, you need not be in a place where you're unhappy, but you could just be looking to tap into your passion a little bit more or reimagine your next steps. You really want to take the time to diagnose. And those of you that are familiar with Simon Sinek and the book Start With Why will probably recognize this. It's what he calls the golden circle. And the purpose of the golden circle is really starting from the bullseye or the why in the middle and moving your way out the concentric circles. And for those of you that are interested, the book is a great read. I give it to a lot of people that I mentor. There's also I think 14, 15-ish minute TED Talk on YouTube that is much more digestible if you're looking for a quick intro. And the sort of thesis behind Start With Why is that people don't buy into what you do. They don't buy into the fact that you're a program coordinator, a physical therapist, a nurse, a postdoctoral fellow. People buy into why you do it. That's how we make connections with each other. That's how we make connections with companies that we're loyal to. And that's how we make connections to our career and what we're passionate about. So let's dive in a little bit more. Another way to think about the why is your purpose. Why do you do what you do? And it can be a very broad question, and you can focus it in more to specific areas of life. But I find that purpose often transcends just professional activities, if we're honest with ourselves. Once you've identified your purpose or the why that drives you, you can then move to the next rung of the circle, which is the how. And that's really the process through which you operationalize your why. Once you've identified that process, the application of your why or your purpose through that process results in the what. So again, we highlighted at the beginning that most people communicate from the outside in. They start talking about what they do, and we rarely ever get to why we do it. Sometimes we talk about the how, but that bullseye just never gets hit. So what we're gonna try to work on as we think through this workshop today is flipping that on its head and starting with the why. Okay, so let me start with myself because I find that it's helpful to make these concepts land with a specific example. So my why, and for those of you that know me or work with me, I am deliberately taking this out of the scientific language I normally use. I believe that when we know better as individuals, as organizations, as a system, as a society, we should do better. So I fundamentally believe that when evidence or experience tells us that we should be doing something differently or we're not meeting our targets, that we should do better. We should find a way to close that gap. So the how that I think that I employ to close that gap is using evidence. As a scientist, that's often research evidence that I generate or that my colleagues generate. But as a health services researcher specifically, it's not just drawing on evidence from health services research, it's drawing on evidence from other fields, business, psychology, human factors engineering, what have you. And as I mentioned before, it's not just what we know from scientific evidence, but what we know from our experiences and the things we learn from each other. So when I think about my career in that way, what I do does not matter because I find it takes care of itself. So let me walk you through a few of the different hats that I wear. One of them, as I mentioned, is a scientist. So when I believe that when we know better, we should do better, I generate evidence to help close the gap. And the way that I operate is as an applied scientist. So if I don't have a mechanism to bring that evidence to the people that need it to make decisions, I'm not realizing my goals as a scientist. And that helps me create a sort of compass for the activities that I engage in that work. Another thing that I do is I'm the founder and executive director of a women's leadership network. So I believe that personally, when we have a sense of what our goals are and whether or not we're reaching them, that we should draw on whatever we can, including support and community from others, to achieve those goals. And I like to use leadership evidence from psychology and business to help us close that gap. So again, when I work from the inside out, I find the what takes care of itself. And I used to be the person in my career, and yes, Tracy, I can replace Simon Sinek. I'll write it in the chat for you. I used to be the person that would start with the what and sit there and say, I don't understand how all this stuff is connected. It feels like I'm just one of those restless people that has my hand in all these different cookie jars and there's no cohesion. And it wasn't until I really started to flip the way I thought about my career that I realized that there are common threads. So if that resonates with you and you find yourself in that position, it is a completely reasonable strategy to start by listing the what or the things that you do or are engaged in and trying to reflect on what the common thread is, and that helps you get to the why. Tip for those of you who don't make the same mistake I did, it is much more helpful to go through that process, bouncing those ideas off someone else who isn't as close to it, friend, colleague, what have you, so they can help you identify the common threads, and then together you can sort of work backwards to the why. Okay, so I would love if anyone feels like they're at the stage where they can share what their why is. It does not matter how articulate it sounds, but let's take a minute or two, depending on how much traction this question gets, for people to try to take a stab at their why. And you're welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like. You're also welcome to just share in the chat. You're also welcome to share in the chat that your mind is blown and you're still thinking about it, if that's where you're at right now. Totally fine. Mind blown, love it. Also, feel free to say what your whats are, and then as a group we can talk through for a second what your why might be. Yes, the idea is to have a fairly coherent why, or one why. It's part of working through it with someone is helping distill it down into something concrete. And it's not that you have to have many whats, you might only have one, but you just want to make sure that whatever you're engaged in, that it connects back to that why, and that's when you'll feel that passion and purpose. I am here to help people. Fantastic. Totally fine to be reevaluating what your new why is, because your why will shift over time. That's another great one. I believe that everyone needs help to be their best self. I'll put mine back up because somebody asked me for an example. Create a health and social care system that helps people. So Joanna, that's really interesting because it seems like your why is to help people or have an impact, and the how you want to do that is through health and social care. So there's different ways you can frame it, but usually Joanna's example of create a health and social care system that helps people is where we all go. We sort of put the how and the why together sometimes, and then we just need to tease it out. But the fact that you're able to make those deeper connections is evidence that your thinking is evolving in the right direction. Another why, to explore and contribute to the relationship between human connection and human condition. Great. Fear of failure drives some. I wish I could jump into that, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of today, but I hear you. Oh, Katie, what a great segue. Is curiosity a why? Okay, so when you think about what drives you to do, if you're having trouble, and I know that this won't be new to some of you. I know my colleague, Anna Ujic, has also used Brene Brown's list of values in some of the conversations that she's had. Let's take a moment to try to rely on a resource to help you identify your why. So could you please take a moment to look at this list? And it's not meant to be exhaustive. It's just meant to give you a place to start and identify 2 to 3 values that resonate with you. Feel free to put them in the chat. Katie, you'll notice that curiosity is on this list. Love it. So again, as these responses are coming in, I just want to point out to people that when it comes to starting with why, not everybody can do that off the top of their head. Sometimes we need to rely on mechanisms or resources that help us articulate that why. That's more often the place that people need to start from. So we have integrity, we have creativity and legacy, wholeheartedness, collaboration, compassion, health. This is awesome. So for those of you that are brainstorming this, whether you're sharing it or not, please write it down. Because we're going to try to carry that through the conversation, and I will definitely not remember what everybody's values were. But this is the first step in sort of filling out your golden circle and mapping out your strategy to refocus. So also keep in mind that generally these values will remain fairly consistent over the course of your life, given where you're all at, but it may evolve, and that's okay. So there may be times in your career, if you're feeling stuck or frustrated, or lacking that passion, that you want to revisit this list and sort of do a little values check to see if you're still in the same place. Okay, so here are some of mine. Growth, learning, making a difference. So making a difference, I often frame as impact. So usually I think a lot of you who I know have heard me say that impact matters to me, and I think it matters to quite a few of you as well, and leadership. So I'm going to give you an example now of how I can start with that value and how I can pull it through the golden circle. Again, this is just to give you an illustrative example. Feel free to try to do the same with your values as I talk through it. Feel free to share it in the chat, whatever works for you. The more that we can give each other examples, the more it will help us develop our own thinking. Also, just to note that for some of you that are coming up with 4 or 5, some people start by coming up with 7. I would encourage you to try to be very real with yourself about what your core 2 to 3 are. It just means that you don't have to make a million different golden circles based on your values. The more clear and concise you can be, the easier it will be. And it doesn't mean that those other values that you sort of put off to the side won't show up. So again, here were those values. Here were those values that I had. And here's how they map. Here's one of the ways they map to my golden circle. So if my why is growth, personal growth, professional growth, all of the growth matters to me. The how that I achieve that growth is through learning. And that's not just sort of traditional academic learning. That's learning from other people. That's learning from observing. That's learning from reading. There are many different ways in which the what of how I do that is different. So that's one example of how those values connect. Here's another one. What drives me is impact. So the value of making a difference or impact is my why. How I operationalize that is through leadership. And what leadership can look like can be, founding and leading a women's leadership network. It can be leading a team. It can be mentoring staff and colleagues. So in both of those examples, there were multiple whats. And again, I want to reemphasize, because the question came up earlier, that you don't have to have multiple whats, but let the what take care of itself. So if you're trying to evaluate a new opportunity and you're having a hard time, your gut doesn't say yes or no clearly, then revisit your why and how to see if it flows. The other great thing that this approach gives you is the flexibility to pivot when something isn't serving you anymore, or it isn't the experience you thought it would be. So again, hopefully, as I'm sort of using my own experiences and story as a backdrop, you can see that this isn't meant to constrain you. It's meant to put a blueprint behind the possibility of both where you currently are and where you might like to go in the future. Because we definitely aren't in a position to know everything that's going to come. But if we have a framework through which we can think about it, then the stress of fear of missing out, or is this the right decision, decreases a bit, because we have a mechanism to have those conversations with ourselves or others. Okay, everybody with me so far? I'm guessing. Okay, thanks for nodding, Marlena. You're like the only face I can see. Okay, so now what do we do about it? So thank you, Alex. So we're in a place now where, maybe we have a list of 5 values, maybe we have 2 clear values, maybe we articulated our why without realizing that there were values embedded in it. So where do we go from here? We need to define our target. And in this very exact moment, I realized that I might need to choose a different word than target, because it looks like we're aiming for the center of the bullseye when we actually just defined what the center of the bullseye was. So metaphorically, this might be confusing. So let's reframe this and say, let's define the application of that why. Okay. Again, so I feel like I need to give, I think she might even be in this workshop, credit to Anna Ujic for turning me on to the update of the top 10 skills. So I won't read through them all, but when you're thinking about where you want your career to go, this is another resource, and it need not be from the World Economic Forum, but find a resource that helps you think through where the future of work is going. And by that, I don't mean is it going to be virtual or in person, but what skills are going to be valued. It helps you set your compass to a target or an area in which you can apply your learning, your growth, whatever you value. So I've given you an example here, but this is not the only resource you can rely on. So as we reflect on this, consider what skills you have from this list, but also consider how they show up and how they transfer to new situations and contexts. Let me give you an example that I think will resonate with a lot of you given your introductions and what you're doing. So for those of you that work in, project management, research, skills that you have are, you can boil it down to the scientific method. The scientific method is a systematic approach to problem solving. That's really what it boils down to. Not everything needs to go through a research ethics board. Not everything needs to have formal interviews and a formal analysis. We do that all the time, analyze data, process information in our day-to-day lives. So if you think about the application of the scientific method as a systematic approach to problem solving, you can think through how you might strip away the sort of framework or infrastructure that you currently operate within. So contracts, ethics boards, research consent, what have you, and think about how to apply that same systematic thinking to a different problem. Let me use an example that might resonate with some of you. For those of you that have a partner, sometimes when you notice that your partner is frustrated, so you're collecting observational data, you ask them how their day went, you try to collect a little bit more information, and then you put those pieces together to try to figure out what's bothering them. And then based on what you know of your partner, you make them dessert, or you take them out for dinner, or you suggest that they, take a walk outside and get some fresh air. So you're using a couple different data sources there, and you're applying that systematic approach to solving problems to a non-scientific example. The reason I specifically chose a personal example is because often we're so constrained in the way we think about the generalizability of our skills that we don't go far enough. So if you can train your mind to think about like the farthest reaching application of your skill set, then it will be easier to sort of calibrate back to how it applies in different professional contexts. I'm going to pause here, like I will with each of our 5 lessons, to see if there are any questions or if anybody has any reflections about identifying a skill that they have and how it might show up or transfer elsewhere. Again, feel free to unmute yourself with or without video if you'd rather share that way, or type in the chat. How to build self-resilience. Well, I will, once we talk about transferability of skills that people feel like they have, we'll touch on how to build the skills that you don't feel like you currently have. Parents are natural project managers. This is true. Conflict de-escalation is a very salient skill for parents. Any thoughts, reflections, or If I don't hear any thoughts or reflections, the assumption I will make is that people are getting stuck here, and my tendency will want to be to help people unpack that. So even if you just let me know that this is landing well, it makes sense, you're just thinking your way through it, that's helpful data for me to collect from you. Thinking through it, awesome. Thanks, everyone. So let's take a moment then to think about, so the first step is reflecting on your sort of current skills inventory. What skills do you currently have? And then imagine how they are applicable or generalizable to a different context. And Jamie, completely agree with you that empathy is a skill that transcends any setting. So there have been questions about how you build skills that you may not already have. So someone asked how we build social influence. Someone else asked how we build self-resilience. When you are thinking about building a skill you don't have, you can sort of, and this will be beyond the scope of this workshop in particular. You want to first get a sense of where you see that skill showing up for other people. So maybe your strategy is, I'm going to read articles about building resilience. Or maybe your strategy is, I am going to identify people in my life who I feel exhibit this quality, and you're going to observe how they show up and how they model resilience for you. And then once you have sort of that endpoint in mind, or the definition of where you want to go, you can draw on whatever tools feel natural to you to help yourself get there. You may seek out training opportunities. You may seek out mentorship to help you think through how to apply things in your daily life. I find that working with mentors or career coaches is a helpful way to sort of have a concentrated focus on developing those plans. The reality is that, I don't want to say for everybody, but for most people, the articulating the path through which you will get from where you are to the development of a skill you don't have isn't something that you do alone. You can draw on colleagues, like you need other people to help you think through that process. So give yourself the permission to identify your goal or where you need to go, and then recognize that you're going to need to draw on the support of others and the expertise of others to help you figure out how to get there. Nobody does all of this stuff alone. The same as, I'll reiterate what I said earlier, even the 5 steps I'm giving you now to refocus your career and develop your strategy, you don't apply them in a vacuum. You'll talk it through with other people. You'll bounce those ideas off others. The more you can get comfortable with the collective effort it takes for any one individual to succeed in their career, the happier you'll be, the faster you'll achieve your goals. And to be honest, the more you'll help other people do the same, both by modeling that behavior in those conversations, but without realizing it, you'll start paying it forward, because you'll be tipping other people onto the wisdom you have. Tracy, your hand's up, go for it.
Hi, I just wanted to say, I think there's also a difference between the acquisition of a skill and the application of a skill.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, with the question around resilience, resilience isn't a skill that I really think about acquiring as being, the acquiring of resilience doesn't really, you don't know that it's happening well unless you're applying it, right? So
brilliant point.
It's just a matter of acquiring or taking a course in this or talking to people about their experiences. You're going to have to experience a situation in which you will have to apply said skill or develop said skill. And I think that's much different than acquisition.
Brilliant point. You're speaking to my behavioral science heart right now. So perhaps it's helpful, it might be a helpful reframe to people to say, there's acquisition of the knowledge or understanding of what a given skill or concept is. So for example, some people might be starting from a place of, what is resilience? What does that even mean? And then you need to have that understanding before, as Tracy highlighted, you can one, form an intention to even develop that skill, but 2, think about the application of that skill set in practice. I also love that I didn't plant any of you in the audience, but you are segueing to the next point so beautifully. So let's jump ahead. So the third sort of individual rule is to execute fearlessly, but deliberately. And I know that somebody made the comment earlier about fear of failure. And while we aren't going to unpack that explicitly, it'll come up a little bit in this lesson. So asking the right question of yourself matters. Sometimes the question isn't whether we should do something, but how we do it, or the strategy behind how we get there. So I'd be hard pressed to think you would meet someone who would tell you that resilience is not a useful skill to build. So it's not really worth your time to debate whether or not skills are useful if they resonate with you initially. It's a better use of your time, as Tracy pointed out, to think about how you actually build that skill and the application of it and how it develops over time. So for those of you that are familiar with Grit, another great book, I'll sort of distill grit down into two equations. So while we can think of people that are born with what seems like an innate level of talent, LeBron James, you might say that Barack Obama has a talent for public speaking. You might say that John Legend has a musical talent. We can all think of those people in your life where you're just like, wow, they were just born with a gift. But what science tells us is that, yes, there's a small degree of people having an innate ability to do something, but it's really the effort or the application of that talent that builds a skill. So think about it like a 25 to 75% ratio. And the 25% is for the talent, the 75% is for effort. I hope this makes you all feel better, because the fact that effort is 3/4 of the equation suggests that just by applying yourself, you can get to a pretty high level of performance. So don't get me wrong, I am not saying that if I apply myself to basketball that I will become LeBron James, but I can become pretty good if I put in the same amount of time that he puts in. So again, first equation is that yes, talent matters, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as effort or application. So talent times effort equals the formation of a skill. And also it's the, effort is, you can equate effort to time here, such that over time you can strengthen a skill. So not trying to complicate things, but just trying to demonstrate that it's not a static, apply it, developed, done. You can strengthen skills, and they can also weaken over time if you don't apply them. So the next equation is that effort times skill equals achievement. So you've developed this skill, but again, it's the application of that skill in some way that leads to an achievement or accomplishment. If LeBron James never plays in the NBA or spends all this time practicing and never applies those skills in a game, clearly you can tell I'm a sports fan, he's not going to have records. He's not going to achieve what he's achieved. He won't have MVP rings. He won't have championship trophies, because he hasn't applied that skill in any way. So again, a couple things I want to point out here, that the development of a skill is not enough. You need to find avenues, arenas in which you can apply those skills in line with your purpose. But two, we see the common variable of effort or time in both of these equations. So put another way, experience is the mechanism through which you build your skills. So applying things, time and time again, or whenever you get the opportunity, is how you build skills, flexing that muscle. And you'll refine the application of things over time. Time is finite. There's no shortcut here for skill development and achievement. I'm sure you've all heard that it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert. There's no shortcut to 10,000 hours. So if you want to build a skill, you can choose your path, but you may want to focus on really developing one skill at a time, or maybe two skills at a time, because if you try to split your time between multiple things, it's going to take you longer to get to the point where you develop that skill. So thinking about this first equation, which means it's going to take you longer to apply that skill towards an achievement. Okay, so another takeaway here is that career strategy, or how we spend our time professionally, is a long game, but it can be broken down into short-term wins or shorter time periods. But that tells you two things. One, it tells you that there's, you know, intermediate or short-term goals that you can have, but it also gives you the flexibility to realize, like, this is a long game. If I took a step and it wasn't the right step, or I developed a skill and it actually doesn't seem like it's as useful as I thought it would be, you've got tons of time. Don't let the pivoting scare you, because pivoting and growing is part of the process. Any thoughts or reflections on this takeaway? Definitely scared. Everyone is pivot. See, you guys said that at the same time. Everyone is scared of the pivot. Everyone. So when you think about executing fearlessly but deliberatively, there's three sources of data that you can rely on. You can rely on conversations with others, whoever they may be, mentors, family members, friends, colleagues. You can rely on facts or evidence, things you know about how many jobs are out there in marketing, how many admission spots are there for this new program, what is the success rate for graduates of this program transitioning to the workforce. But then there's your own experience. And I really think that, I hope for you all that through this reflective process, you get to a point where you trust your own experience and the sort of gut feeling that that gives you. If you're not happy with something, or you don't feel passionate about it, that's a pretty good barometer for needing to revisit what you're doing, or your golden circle, to sort of figure out where to focus your efforts. So any reflections on a couple things, either skills you think you have that are transferable, skills you think you'd like to develop, or the sort of data, as per this slide, that you're going to draw on to think about those things. Great point, Tracy. So Tracy just said that you can also rely on your purpose or your why, which is why it's important to have clarity about that, independent of the what, or the job, or the title. I think a lot of you have heard me say that when people ask me what I want to do in my career next, I can't tell them what the title is, but I can tell them what I want the role to look like. I can tell them what I value. And you know, we've talked about some of those things. For me, it's growth, leadership, learning, and I need those to show up. And if those things show up in an opportunity, then, you know, I don't really care what the title is, because I care about the work. And I'm not saying that title doesn't matter. We can have a separate conversation about that, but just recognizing that it matters more, like it matters more what you're doing. That's what will make you happy, not the title you have on your business card. How do you reconcile what you want versus what opportunities are available to you? Okay, I'm going to be a little bit, I'm going to push back a little bit on that question. I think that the frame through which you're thinking about the opportunities that are available to you needs to be broadened. And so for some people, if you're like, I work at Sunnybrook Hospital in the legal department, for example, you can't confine the definition of your opportunities to that department or that institution. If you think about the skill set that you have, take a step back and reflect on, I mean, if you want to be really provocative, what other industries is that skill set useful in? What other roles is that skill set useful in? The easiest example for me to give, because I live it all the time, is people who have graduate level scientific training and feel like the only career path for them is in research. And there are so many other industries and organizations that rely on that critical thinking and systematic approach to problem solving, but we're just not socialized to think of that as an option. And so another strategy you can employ here is, when you're having conversations with people to collect your data, deliberately have conversations with people who don't really have a strong sense of what you do, or the industry you work in, so that they can help you see the forest for the trees, or really pull out of the weeds as you analyze opportunities. So there was another comment around fear of going after what you want and finding out that nothing exists to fulfill that. While that there is always the possibility that that's true, I have never went through this exercise with someone and had them feel like there's no opportunity to fulfill that need when you start with what you value. What I have seen time and time again is people identify the what without the why, and then feel like they don't see that what anywhere. So for example, I love animals and advocacy and TikTok, and I wish there was an opportunity that allowed me to bring those three things together. Like that doesn't, if you start from a place of why, the sort of width of that lens and how far it can extend will shine light on so many opportunities. We just aren't used to looking at things that way. Any other questions before we move on? For me, it's about building new skills from the skills you already have. So if you think a skill of yours is creativity, originality, but what you struggle with is how to apply that skill you have to impact. So what you're doing is looking to individuals who have that strong skill to apply change and impact and learning from them. Great comment, Marlena. I think, so reading this comment, just a couple of things for people to consider if this resonates with you. So as I mentioned, and one of the things Marlena highlighted is you can look to individuals who you feel like operationalize that well, like creativity and originality in an area where you have impact. And where that will hopefully get you is to a point where you can reflect on, what does that actually mean? Like, how am I defining impact in the application of creativity and originality? And let me give you an example. You could define it as, so as a scientist, you could say, you know, it's applying creativity and originality to communicating research results in non-traditional ways. So that's a way that creativity and originality could show up in my area of work in order to have impact. So it's to reach populations that we don't typically reach when we talk about disseminating or sharing research evidence. Similarly, you can think about how that would show up in a lot of different ways. And often creativity and originality show up as doing things differently. So if you start from a place of defining what impact means to you, then you can, you know, you start from that why of the impact you want to have, and then think about, often we call it like a blue sky exercise of, if there were no constraints and everything was feasible, what's the most meaningful way you can do this? And then you work backwards from there. All right, doesn't look like there's any other questions, so we'll move on. Happy to take a moment as we move on to take the pulse of the group and see how we're doing. Are we giving people lots to think about? Does anyone feel like their wheels are spinning and they really want to get off this ride? Or does it feel like it is useful?
Laura?
Very useful, yes.
I was wondering if you could speak to, like, I keep looking at Min's comment, and it makes me think of not just fear specifically, but how barriers play in, and understanding your barriers just as much as you understand your facilitators might play into this conversation.
Oh, okay, okay, I don't have slides for this, but let's unpack this for a minute. No, this is great. I'd rather like not even get through my slides if the content is relevant for people, but I'm just saying that so that people know you don't really need to pay attention to the visual right now. So two things I want to point out that are distinctions, but are related concepts here. One is, we talk about skills and strengths. So I want to acknowledge that you don't need to have, and there are different camps on this. Some people are like, you really should focus on shoring up your areas of weakness. And while there is some truth to that, I mean, if you have no communication skills and you're in a communication facing role, you might want to develop those, but it's equally important to focus on the strengths you have and how to amplify those. And so one of the approaches I take at a high level is, I can understand the skills I need to do my job, or that my team needs, and the skills that I don't have, I surround myself with people who have those skills. Because keep in mind that it is unlikely that for any prolonged period in your career, you're going to be going it alone, that you won't be working with anyone else at all. Even if it's, even if you have you're an entrepreneur and you have your own business and you're the only employee, you're still working with clients. And so think about the different ways and you can draw on other people's strengths. Where the conversation just went is a conversation around the barriers that can get in your way when you're thinking about career development or opportunities. And Tracy, I think that was you based on the voice, but feel free to jump in and let me know if I'm misreading your question. So to oversimplify, and by that I mean to recognize that there may be other categories here, we can think of two categories of barriers. There are sort of systemic barriers and organizational barriers. So, I don't think it's any news to anyone on this call that we could acknowledge systemic racism. We can acknowledge structural barriers against women and marginalized groups. We can acknowledge a lot of things that are beyond the scope of this conversation to change when it comes to opportunities and career growth. But I do just want to take a minute to acknowledge that that is part of the picture. But we're going to try to start from a place of what we can control. So the other type of barrier is our own sort of cognitive barriers, or how we think. And there are free online tools or assessments that you can access that can help you figure out how your own thought patterns might be getting in your own way. And it might be something like, so I'm going to use language around positive intelligence right now, and you can Google positive intelligence. There's a website. It lets you do a free assessment to get a sense of how your thought patterns might be getting in the way of your growth and progress and happiness. But you may find out that you are a restless person and you're constantly looking for the next thing. And that constantly looking for the next thing may mean, while it has positive attributes, that you aren't fully developing your skills or taking the time to apply them. If you think back to, let me just go back so people can see it, this slide on developing skills and then applying those skills for achievements or accomplishments. So thank you, Marlena. So there are different things, different systematic approaches you can take and assessments you can do to identify what is within your control and related to how you think that might be tripping you up or getting in your way. But what I'm happy to discuss towards the end if we have time, but I didn't build into this talk, is the recognition that there are things outside of our immediate control that will affect our careers and our progression. But in my experience, there is a significant amount of happiness and fulfillment to be gained by focusing on what you can control and applying that. And I've yet to come across anyone that has reached the limits of what they can achieve through that approach. Was that helpful?
I mean, yes, it was, but I don't necessarily think that's what I meant.
Okay, help me understand then what you meant. Talk through it a little bit more.
So I actually think I was just reframing what you were already doing with like a bracket, like by telling people. So for example, when you were explaining how looking at your why can help overcome, for me, that seemed like an intentional strategy in the process to overcome a barrier that someone might have created around getting to that, right? So like, if you start at the what, then you constantly end up with barriers that end up, you never quite get to your why, where you can use, if you have the why first, then you can use that to circumvent some of the barriers that you might either you're putting up or that you're coming up to around getting back to that. That's all.
Great point. And part of what I'm hearing
that was good.
Thanks. Part of what I'm hearing and what you said is also that you're right that it is 100% meant to be a strategy, but also sometimes when we start from the what, you're operating in somebody else's mind or from their values or how they view the world and the sort of opportunities they've created, and that makes it harder for you to identify opportunities and figure out where you fit. We're all unique and we all think in our own ways, so I guess it's just another way in which this strategy helps you overcome not just barriers in how you think about something, but in how you interact with opportunities and the professional world. Okay, let me get back to where we were. Okay, so number 4 of number 5, so we'll have a little bit of time for conversation, is about not making assumptions. And so we've seen this theme of failure come up a little bit in this conversation. And one of my favorite quotes is this one by Henry Ford, that failure is the opportunity to begin again more intelligently. I would love if failure wasn't part of our lexicon, and the reality is that it is. So really, if we think about the times, let's take a moment, and you can just say, yes, or this isn't true for me in the chat. Think about the times that you have failed, in your opinion, or something has failed. Was it catastrophic, or was it not the end of the world? Because often, at least I'm not in a position powerful enough for it to be the end of the world, and you learn something from it. The true failure would be, fool me once, shame on you, or shame on me, fool me twice. Anyways, I'm now not saying the quote right, I just messed it up, but fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. So if you make the same mistake twice, then you haven't learned. So I'm curious whether you choose to put it in the chat or not. If you reflect on the times you think you have failed, was it actually that bad, or did you bounce back pretty quickly? And if you can't think of a time right now that you have failed, chances are it wasn't that bad, because I'd be shocked if at some point in your life you didn't feel like you had failed or something didn't go the way you planned. And for me, that's one of the strategies I use when I step into something that, I'm nervous about, or am worried about whether people will enjoy it or whether it will land the wrong way, that like nothing I have done has had a lasting effect. It may have been a bit of a sting initially, but it passed. And the more clarity I had around what I wanted to do and the people I was working with, the more I absorbed that failure and the less impact it had on me. Never catastrophic, but you find that it's your own confidence that you struggle with. 100%. Imposter syndrome is real, and happy to unpack that or whatever else people want to chat about as we get to the end of this talk. So here, try to adopt the mindset, let it sting for a minute if you need to process that emotion, but adopt the mindset of a continual learner and approach situations with the questions of, what can I learn here? And how do I make this better next time? And if you ask yourself, either yourself those questions or your colleagues those questions, if you feel like you failed and it's visible, then that's what people are going to remember, that this wasn't intentional and that you're trying to learn from it. So assume the best in yourself and others. Also assume and accept the fact that you don't have it right at the outset. Nothing is perfect. This talk is even a great example. The 5 things that I've crafted for you all don't cover all of the questions you have or all of the aspects of career development and refocusing that you're interested in. And so if I can approach a talk like this with that open mind, it doesn't feel like I've failed you, because we've created a dialogue to have that question. So to do this, again, you just need to reframe failure as an opportunity to learn. And if you're growing, that is the goal. That is progress towards your why and the happiness that you're looking for. Any questions? That's it for this one. It's just put in place whatever strategies may work for you to try to overcome that. Some of them, in addition to the questions I ask myself that I just framed, is that when I am worried about something, worried about failure, I text or reach out to or talk to people in my network and say, I'm terrified about this, and they'll reassure me that I have no reason to, or they'll tell me things I should consider to make sure if it's the right opportunity, or all that kind of stuff. So again, coming back to that theme of really lean on your network and support system to help you think through some of those things, because the more we stay inside our own heads, the more challenging it gets. No one achieves anything alone. Not yet catastrophic, often traumatic, usually mostly injuries to my pride. So what's interesting about the comment of injuries to your pride, or sort of feeling personally wounded, is why does it injure your pride? And one of the reasons could be, is it because you care so much about this that you wanted to do it well? In which case, I applaud you, because you're doing something that likely aligns with your why, whether you realize it or not. And if it's injuring your pride because, like so many of us, you care a lot about what other people think, then maybe reflect on what you can learn from that as well. But even unpacking how it injures your pride is a helpful exercise. Okay, last lesson. Break away from siloed thinking. So I described at the beginning how when you start from a place of what, so if I think about my role as a scientist, my role as a coach, a speaker, running a women's leadership network, even the way I'm describing those things by the what is sort of putting them in little silos or blocks beside each other. When you can start to shift to a values first frame or starting with your why, these activities become more of a Venn diagram, and you can see the overlap in how things are showing up. I really want to point out here that when you start your Venn diagram, as you go through this exercise, you may feel like you have 3 circles or 4 circles or whatever that are like not even touching at all. But part of your goal can be thinking about, how do I bring these activities together? Or maybe some of these activities are things I should leave behind, because when you find that circle that's like way out here, often I have found that people reflect that that has no connection to their why, and that's part of why they don't feel a lot of purpose in what they're doing. You slowly work your way to, the intersections of 2 bubbles. So let me take a step back, find bubbles that are connected to your why, then find activities that operate at the intersection of those bubbles, and then try to identify activities that intersect all 3. And those bubbles could be your values, like there's different ways you can frame these categories, or they could be, roles that you have, and you could populate the Venn diagram with activities within those roles. So again, I'll sort of lay out a systematic step to this. You can map out your current activities or your current values. That visual, then you reflect on and say, where do these things fall? Is there alignment between what brings you the most joy or excitement and where it sits within your diagram? Once you've gone through that, you can filter future opportunities that come your way, even if it's within your current role, based on where they fall within your career strategy Venn diagram. So for me, if it falls in that center of the 3 pieces, I say yes every time. Because even if I feel like I have a lot on my plate, that activity brings me joy and I feel so much connection to it. If it only sits in one of those bubbles and has no overlap, then the only reason I say yes is because I have to as part of my job. And over time, you hope that you can curate things to a point where, at a minimum, things fall into 2 overlapping bubbles. And that's sort of described as improving your accuracy and your precision as you progress in your career. So let me take a second and put that into the chat in case it's helpful for people. Okay, there's those 3 questions for those of you that want to have them. Okay, so this is a career differential diagnosis, which is, again, I'm just trying to give you different resources you can use to think through things. So I just gave you the Venn diagram approach. Here's another way to think about it. You can start by making a list of all of those activities, so all the things that you do. And then from there, sort of dragging and dropping to what is it that you're doing that you enjoy? Like, what activities come your way that you look forward to? Is it, presenting to other people? Is it diving into, research or information on something? Is it designing graphics because you're more creative? Like, you can get into the specific activities or tasks that you might get into in your job. When you look at that list, are there things that you're doing that if you had the choice, you'd like to move away from? You don't like presenting to people, or you really don't like being the person that has to look up information, and recognizing that it might take you a while to get to that point, but that recognition in and of itself helps you understand the type of role and activities within it that will make you the most happy. Then your next column is, what aren't you doing that you would like to do? And again, you may find that within your immediate sort of professional sphere, or you might have to look beyond it. So you may say, I would love to be able to present results to our partners, but I don't currently get to do that. You could take it beyond your organization and be like, wow, I would love to be an expert that, you know, gets brought in for media articles, or I would love to be someone who works directly with the communities that we're trying to impact. I would love to be the person that gets to think through how we do things differently. Whatever it would be, it can be very concrete, like a very specific activity or task, or it can be very high level. Like I just mentioned, the idea that you would be the person who thinks about how to do things differently. Then when you've done that, you can link it back to the exercise we did earlier around thinking about the skills you might need to develop to help you do the things that you would like to do. So maybe you need to develop PowerPoint skills if the groups you want to communicate to like PowerPoint decks. Maybe you need to come up with ways to communicate complex topics in very clear language because you want to be able to share messages via mass media. So there are different ways to think through it. But again, this is just meant to be a systematic approach that you can take if the Venn diagram approach doesn't really work for you. The Venn diagram is a little bit more visual, whereas this is sort of a, you know, you create your table and you bring things into it. You can also use both. Sometimes I like to do the visual because I need to map concepts. And sometimes I feel like I really need to get into the specifics of sort of tasks in my role. The great thing about this specific approach is that when you're thinking about tasks in your role, you may all of a sudden identify opportunities in your current role, organization, team, what have you, for growth or for something different. So you can sort of take that frame of what do I see around me that I might love to do, and then speak to your manager, your team, your colleagues, what have you, about whether it's possible to make that happen. And you know, if you're in the right type of place, I would be shocked if your colleagues don't try to support you in helping you get exposure to the things you'd like to be exposed to, but they can't help you get there if you don't ask. And you can't ask if you haven't articulated to yourself that that's something you're interested in. Okay, so the other point I just want to make quickly here, I've sort of mentioned it earlier, is that you don't want to miss the forest for the trees. So as you go through this exercise or exercises like it, just take a minute to step back and reflect on the extent to which the tasks you come up with, or sort of the line items that either go in the bubbles for the Venn diagram or that go in the columns for this differential diagnosis, reflect the sort of day-to-day responsibilities of your job versus your broader career objectives. And people will start from different places, but to truly operationalize your why, you want to get to a place where you're not so much talking about, let's use a research example, I hate doing REB applications, or I never want to make another slide deck again, or I'd really love to improve my writing skills, and step back to think about more broadly what that could mean. I really want to have impact through communication, or I really want to develop my public speaking skills. So if you're the kind of person that starts with the minutia, make sure that you take a moment to think about the broader themes or career development objectives that can connect to. If you're a big picture thinker and you think about those big things, then you need to take the time to recognize how they show up in your current role, organization, opportunities, so that you have a sort of immediate plan, for lack of a better description, on how to act on some of the insights you're generating. And then, as Tracy sort of explicitly brought up earlier, once you've articulated your career strategy, don't forget to identify how you want to implement it. And that's beyond the scope of this workshop. But think about what your sort of individual brand or your why is and how you're going to develop that. Think about cultivating your network, those people that I've spoken about that you'll use along the way to bounce ideas off of, crystallize how you're thinking. Think about how you'll achieve influence. Who do you want to, what groups do you want to have influence with? Why? What's the way to influence those groups? And what's your visibility to people who make key decisions, both within your current role and beyond, that may give you other opportunities? So that's just a little bit of food for thought, but this exercise is all for naught if you go through developing your strategy and identifying these things and you don't think about how to execute it. So that's all the content I have for you. What I would love is I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can maybe see some of your faces if you're willing to come on camera, and we can have a little bit of a conversation about where you're at, what you're thinking about, questions you might have. Anything is fair game. Don't all talk at once though. Let me pull the chat back up now that my screen has shifted all over the place. Reflections, thoughts, useful, overwhelming. KV, you're snacking and nodding. Two things I very much appreciate. Do people feel like they have a lot of stuff to chew on? Where do you feel like you're at in this journey? Questions about mentorship and where to access formal career mentorship across Canada. Happy that it's useful, Evelyn. So this is just my personal opinion when it comes to mentorship. I find that I shy away from describing things as formal mentorship opportunities because mentorship relationships are the most effective when it's organic and when you connect with someone around your why. And it may be that, you know, you work in a similar place or they're doing something, like there is a what alignment, that they're doing something that you might like to do. But I think that the challenging thing is people find it hard to access mentors. So I want to make sure I can address your question. When you're trying to find mentors, as somebody who gets asked to mentor people a lot and as someone that seeks out mentors, if you aren't clear on your why, it makes it very hard to make a meaningful connection in a way that someone can support you. Some people have mentors within their organization. I would encourage those of you that do, and even those of you that don't, to also think about seeking mentors outside of your organization. I would also encourage you to think broadly about the concept of mentorship. So we all default to find somebody senior that has a lot of influence in an impressive position and let me connect with them. Some of the most valuable mentors I've had in my career have actually been peers who are going through the same thing as me and can help me think about the challenges I'm going up against from a different perspective. And also hearing their why and how they're approaching things helps me refine mine, because I can be like, wow, that's great. That's really clear. Nope, I don't want to do that. Or that actually sounds really interesting. I should think about that further as I refine my why. And most recently, one of the most valuable things to me, although I'm quite confident that the people who serve this function in my life may not know they serve it, is having mentors who are junior to you. And they challenge you to think about things in a different way. And they challenge the hidden assumptions you don't even know that you've developed about how you approach things, how you're thinking about your own career. So there was another specific question about women's college hospitals. So how to have your resume be recognized and taken up at any organization. I would say there's always a formal application process, and you have to go through that formal application process. But in your application, do whatever you can to make yourself stand out. So again, highlighting the why is a really impactful way to do that. That's what people remember. They want to get to know you when you apply. They don't want to get to know your qualifications necessarily, because they're trying to decide if you're a good fit. What you can also try to do is, if you're a little more search savvy, is try to find out who the people are on the team that you're applying to, and whether you can reach out to them and just say to them, this is why I'm really interested in this role, and I just wanted to let you know that I've applied. When it comes to mentorship and applying for jobs, and I know that this is hard when you're looking for either one of those things, you want to be mindful of not approaching that situation solely with an ask for the other person. You sort of want to bring that information to them and say, so here's an example of how I sometimes see if it's possible to form a mentorship relationship. I would say to somebody, hey, Marlena, I saw this really great article. Again, I'm a scientist, which is why I'm using this example. And I know that you're really interested in equity, so I just wanted to put it on your radar. So you can think of ways to create value for the people that matter to you or that you want to build in your network. Again, senior colleagues and junior people. And if you focus on providing value for other people and not at the expense of your own time or labor or what have you, but just being considerate of what matters to them, I think you'll realize that it goes a long way. So everything really connects back to your why and understanding what matters to other people. Because the reality is most people are happy to help other people. They just need to know what that help looks like and in what way it's valuable. One of the things that's hardest for me is when people approach me about mentorship or advice and I don't know what it is they're looking for and I don't know how to help them. And that's, if sometimes when people are busier, if that's a challenge, it becomes harder to put in the effort to help someone. So if you can do that work for people, it might help you get more traction on opening up possibilities and building relationships. Yeah, I would agree, Tracy. I think mentors who are junior to me have almost been the most powerful in helping me think differently. Thoughts on the best way to spend your time to start with and develop a career path if you don't have a huge amount of time? Young kids, current job, has to stay for a bit, but has nothing to do with eventual lives and goals. Okay, great question. The first thing I want to say is that if, given everything that's going on in the world right now, if you're really short on time, at a minimum, this kind of thinking and reflecting, which you can do on the couch after the kids go to bed, or when you wake up in the morning and hopefully they're still quiet, or in those moments where you just have a second to yourself, spend that time thinking about what would make you happy and make sure you're clear on that. If you have clarity on your why, again, when you don't have time to implement, the next step is blue sky, cast your net wide. And what are all of the ways in which you could realize this why? And an example that I'll use is, we have a lot of interest in Women Who Lead, the women's leadership network that I run, completely volunteer-led, a very fierce team of brilliant women. But what I hear from all of them repeatedly is that it connects so directly to their why and their passion. And it's allowing them that, I think all of them are building skill sets or sort of applying their skills in ways they might not get to in their usual role. So you can look for volunteer opportunities where you can be clear on how much time is this going to take. So if you only have an hour a week and that hour is piecemeal because you're responsible for tiny humans or pets or something else, then find an opportunity that allows you to contribute asynchronously. And so again, this is more of an individual level thing, but I'm trying to give you a sense of how you can think through it. But once you're clear on what those opportunities you might look like, your kids will get older and will get more independent. I am also telling this to myself with a 3-year-old and a 10-month-old. And that time will free up. And if you've already put in the time to think about what would matter to you, when that opportunity presents itself, you'll be ready. So I'll stop there for now in case people have other questions, but there is brainstorming and data collecting and observing opportunities that you can do. And one more point related to that, even if you don't have the time, connecting with people who are in those roles and currently doing them may give you a sense of skills you can develop that would make you more competitive for that type of a role when you're ready to make a switch to a different job. And there are lots of ways you can think about doing that. And sometimes it doesn't even mean you have to change what you're doing in your current role. You just need to market it differently. So I'll pause there. Any other questions, thoughts, reflections? I'm hopeful this is just wheels turning because you're all still here. From my perspective, the entire point of a workshop like this is to provide value to the people that show up. So really we dictate what we cover based on what it is you need and what you are all looking for. I'm thrilled that Diabetes Action Canada agreed to host this. I was fortunate enough to receive one of their, as a postdoctoral fellow, a mentorship award of theirs. And when I reached out to Michelle, our gracious host in the background today, about a way that I could give back to the community, I had imposter syndrome because I thought that there was no way a research organization and a patient-focused organization would want to host a talk on career strategy. But it was, that fellowship through Diabetes Action Canada gave me the space to reconnect with my why, and I try to share it with as many people as I can. So just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge why we are all here and why we're able to plug into this kind of thinking. So thanks to Diabetes Action Canada, and more importantly, thanks to all of you, because if I had imposter syndrome about pitching the idea to them, it would have been a whole lot worse if none of you showed up and nobody was interested. So Marlena just put a comment in the chat that I don't know why none of you like to unmute except Tracy. I also think that the reason why we focus on finding fulfillment in our career is because we're trying to find fulfillment, period. Couldn't agree more. And since we spend so much time working, we automatically look to optimizing our career. 100% that thinking about how to operationalize your values in non-paid life, whether that be like volunteer opportunities or even personally, how that shows up in your relationships, is huge. And no, we can't all be Brene Brown to ourselves or to anyone, but I try to be similarly vulnerable. So super helpful to see that reflection, but also a great point for all of us to consider that a lot of what we talked about today doesn't need to, its limits aren't confined to how you think about things professionally. And often when you start to think about reframing things with your why, you'll find spillover into non-professional things as well. And then sort of in a, I don't know, a somewhat cheesy vein, it's just made me happier in both arenas. Because I find the work I do more meaningful, which means I show up at home and in personal relationships with more energy. And I just share a lot more of those things. So, hopefully this is the start for all of you from wherever you're at, working towards sort of more alignment between what you're doing now and those things that really energize you and bring you joy, keeping in mind that maybe this is just what I do to manage my own expectations, but I think that it's unrealistic to think we're going to get to 100% of loving everything we do all the time. But research shows us that if you 20% of your work day or professional week is spent doing stuff you're passionate about, that you will be happy at work. So if all we're aiming for is 20%, I think we've got a pretty solid start on how to get there. Yeah, I also talk faster than I type, but also appreciate that if I wasn't the one giving this workshop, I'd probably be in sweatpants with my camera off too. So no judgment. It's also my favorite thing. I say to my team sometimes that I will judge you positively if you show up on Zoom in sweatpants. Happy to give everybody 8 minutes back in their day, so feel free to log off if you'd like. For those of you that want to have a little bit more of a chat, I will hang around for the next couple minutes.